no one in the UK I know of, or any kind of press outlet, regardless of whether they're cannabis or CBD or psychedelic focused, talked about this. We've published on Valentine's Day. The obvious thing to do is like a gift guide for CBD and your love life. But we published an article about female orgasms leading to a release of DMT because it's love based, but it's a bit different.
Truthfully covering cannabis culture. As editor of major digital cannabis publication Leafy, Liam O'Dowd has soaked up cannabis culture and helped foster an honest space where veterans and newbies alike can come and be educated and entertained by all things weed and psychedelics. So, welcome to Lobsterpot. I'm Dave Barton, here, as always, joined by Jamie Bonthron, my partner in crime.
Good afternoon.
How you doing? You right?
Yeah, I'm getting there. Dealing with the heat.
Yeah, the heat. Well, it's quieting down a bit, but apparently it's coming back with a vengeance this weekend. We shall see. Today we're joined by Liam O'Dowd, editor. We're saying editor or CEO? What do you go by these days?
Yeah, I mean, I am the kind of accidental editor and co-founder of Leafy.
Excellent. So, yeah, tell us more about Leafy, what you're doing, and we'll go from there. So over to you, Liam.
So Leafy is a online magazine. We kind of bill ourselves as or content-led platform. We've been around for about 3.5 years now. We started off talking about CBD, and we've slowly moved into the world of cannabis and psychedelics, all really interesting subjects. We try and keep ourselves pretty consumer focused, so we swerve around the business news and the kind of industry developments. So the idea is that we're kind of an education and entertainment platform for people who are curious about cannabis, psychedelics, CBD, not necessarily, hardcore aficionados or embedded in the culture, but people who want to know a little bit more about these subjects and kind of want to look at them with an open mind and try and find out a little bit more about whether they could benefit them or whether, find out the information that they need without kind of necessarily getting sucked into becoming like a hardcore stoner or a hippie wandering around barefoot, living out the back of a LVV van.
I think that's about the perfect, elevator pitch you could give for Leafy, really. You've definitely done that once or twice before.
I've never mentioned the LDV van before, but I just
that's new.
But yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
No, it's great. We've spoken before, and obviously we've spoken just prior to this as well. And it's very clear that there's a real drive for kind of social equity and social responsibility within, well, from you personally, but within the kind of Leafy brand and as part of the education or the educational piece that is part of what you do. The work that you've done previously, your background, is in digital marketing, isn't it? And I'm sure you could speak to a lot more detail on that than I could, but with that background, how do you think that kind of informs what you do now and how you go about doing it with that kind of social responsibility aspect as well?
Yeah, I mean, the marketing background was actually kind of what got to, well, it's what actually gave birth to Leafy. So there's a long story behind it. I'll try and give you the short version, but essentially my friend and I were looking at launching a CBD brand. I mean, we're talking about 4.5, 5 years ago now. So very early stage. And because I've been doing a lot of marketing work for e-commerce brands, I did the logical, we kind of had an idea of coming at it from the angle of a brand for people in sports and fitness. And I was looking at we were kind of looking at the brand, how we would go to market, who our audience was. And I very quickly kind of realized that there was two things that were missing, two problems that needed solving. So one was that every brand, and this still exists within CBD and cannabis and stuff now, but every brand was struggling to access customers because social media platforms, search engines, etc., they won't allow paid ad spend to build an audience and to market to. But also, I mean, there was a kind of the light bulb moment was that the reason I personally wanted to get into CBD was my dad had been ill, and I'd done a load of research into CBD and cannabis and how it could help him based on his diagnosis. And I spent a lot of time reading medical journals, cannabis advocacy blogs, kind of stoner blogs. So, a guy in a bedroom, very passionate about the plant, trying to kind of educate people. But there wasn't an accessible point of information at the time, 4 years ago, about CBD. So you either had to kind of wade through jargon and reports and medical studies, or you had to kind of go on blogs that were kind of very pro-cannabis, pro-legislation, talking about much broader subjects. And this was before the kind of CBD became a bit of a darling in the press for about 6 months. So we saw this problem that needed solving, really, that people needed access to information about CBD, didn't necessarily want to get kind of sucked into cannabis culture. I mean, I always say the idea was originally behind Leafy was that you could send your auntie or your gran or a more conservative member of your family an article on Leafy that was educational about CBD, and she wouldn't necessarily kind of start clutching her pearls, or he start clutching their pearls at the idea that they would have to go and meet some kind of dodgy guy in a Vauxhall Corsa behind Tesco at 10 p.m. So the idea was we would take something, at the time CBD was very much associated with cannabis, but take it and distill it and make it more accessible, more understandable for people like my dad who took CBD and actually got a really positive outcome from it. So that was kind of that marketing background. It led to this kind of light bulb moment, like, look, the industry has a problem, we can solve it. And today, it's still kind of, it kind of helps us, push us in the direction that we want to go. So, we did eventually start talking about cannabis. Originally, we were just going to be CBD, but as medical cannabis kind of came to light and more and more people needed information on that. And the same with psychedelics. I mean, when we started talking about psychedelics, we noticed the movement and the kind of the birth of this new wave of psychedelic research and interest. We didn't get straight involved. We kind of waited for a little bit for it to kind of gather some steam, so people didn't kind of look at it and go, what are these guys on about? But also we got in there and started talking about it kind of before the burst or the kind of the explosion. So, it kind of that background does help. Obviously, it helps with kind of a lot of the technical stuff. I've done a bit of SEO. I've done photography in the past, and that kind of, we're very particular about our visual style and the imagery we use. I did study graphic design before I did marketing. So again, it all kind of leads into, and all these little things that I've done and experienced have kind of led to helping us, kind of drive Leafy and make it a bit more than just another website or another blog. We've tried to use that knowledge that we have and make it more of a kind of a magazine or an online platform for people to find educational and entertaining content.
I think that's very much the case. When you go on that, it's very clear that it isn't just a place that has, you talked about steering clear of business news. It is a place where you can go and you can be informed, you can be educated, but you can also have interesting stories. And it has a real vibe of actual journalism. It isn't just delivering a series of facts and going, here is something that is happening. Here's a story, stick with it, go from start to finish. It has there's clear narratives within it. You can learn something. It's about people as well. It's very clear from that perspective. Is there something for you that makes a perfect cannabis story or a perfect psychedelic story? What is it that
that's a good question.
Those pieces that you see or that are sent to you that you really love, why does it jump out off the page? That's
a really good question. There's two answers to that. So there's two kinds of perfect story, I suppose. So there is obviously the ones that are performance driven, kind of, we're looking for things that are popular. We want people to read, share, link to us and accelerate our growth. They tend to be kind of more educational. Education content is the backbone of what we do, and that will always be the backbone of what we do. Stuff kind of around politics and law and regulation and kind of changes, they always do well. Activism, and also kind of well-known brands or names, I would say, but like not necessarily brands. So, a good example is we had someone in Thailand who he lives there, and he pitched us a story about the history of Thai stick. Well-known name within cannabis. It's not a brand as such, but everyone's heard of it. He wrote a story about its origins, challenging some of the misconceptions or misunderstandings, and actually tried to recreate it based on the recipe that he found online, not with much success. But that always does really well. It's an evergreen article for us. We've written about cookies coming to London. People want to know about these brands and how it relates to them. So they're, in terms of the metrics, they're the perfect stories, and they're always good. But there is another kind of perfect story, and maybe they're a bit more personal to me, or maybe they're more a bit about what kind of make Leafy and differentiate us. So we have a lot of stories that are kind of, I would say they're kind of untold stories, or they're unusual. And some examples I would guess of that. There's one I always come back to that Ruby Devoy wrote for us a year ago now. And it's about whether the endocannabinoid system is the place where consciousness resides, right? No one really knows what consciousness actually is. We can't prove it. You can't document it, but we know we all have one. And she kind of proposed this theory, and it's just a theory because it's quite out there, that, you know, maybe it resides in the ECS, and it's the ECS that makes up what makes us human and have a consciousness. And I Google it every now and then to see if anyone's ever said anything about this before, and it's not. We're the only people who've ever published a story like that. I mean, we had one recently that was about a cannabis cafe opened in Israel. 2 owners, 1 Arab, 1 Jew. They brought this cannabis cafe to life because they wanted to bridge divides and gaps in the community and make cannabis more accessible. And then it burned down. Someone burned it down. And, you know, again, that was no one in the UK I know of, or any kind of press outlet, regardless of whether they're cannabis or CBD or psychedelic focus, talked about this. You know, we've published on Valentine's Day. The obvious thing to do is like a gift guide for CBD and you know, your love life. But we published an article about female orgasms leading to a release of DMT because it's love-based, but it's a bit different. And these are the ones that I love because, and I'll often share them on social media where I'll say, this is one of those stories that made me go, wow. But they're also the ones that when we're at events like, you know, we were at Cannabis Roper the other week and having conversations with people, and they're always the ones that people say, oh, I love Leafy. I love this story you did on this. And it's always the stories of those. They might not have, you know, 6-figure views like some of our articles, but they're always the ones that people talk to me about because they're different, they're interesting, they're unique. And also from the perspective of, you know, what we're trying to do essentially with Leafy is we're trying to educate, but we're also kind of trying to challenge some conceptions, break down a few barriers, you know, get rid of a bit of stigma. And these stories to me are always the ones that, you know, maybe you're having a coffee on a Sunday morning out on your patio and you think, well, that's an interesting subject. I'll read that. And it might not necessarily be someone who's like a diehard weed fan, but they read this story about, you know, kind of an Israeli cannabis cafe trying to heal decades of trauma through, you know, sharing a joint. And they're the ones that people will read and go, actually, maybe I'm looking at cannabis the wrong way. Maybe I'm looking at psychedelics from the wrong angle, because they're interesting stories in their own right. And what they help to do is kind of bring people into a new way of understanding without necessarily ramming them stuff down the throat saying, you know, we should legalize weed now. And for me personally, all right, they might, like I say, they might not be the ones that go off the scale on reader numbers, but they're the ones that always kind of make Leafy what Leafy is, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think it's about familiarizing and normalizing sort of cannabis in varying scenarios. And I think the more diverse the knowledge or the information you put out there, the more people relate to it in those different ways. And I think, again, I think that's kind of what we're trying to do in a way. Just kind of you pursue what's interesting, and you kind of create the content you want to see in a way. And if that helps other people, it resonates with them as well. You think, okay, cool. Well, then that's change someone else's perceptions about it. But that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think there are some interesting personal stories from around the world as well. I mean, it's good to get those kind of perspectives too, I always think. So
definitely
massively humanizing. You mentioned the business of what you do, looking at the metrics and what performs the best and what is best for Leafy as a company. As someone, I presume, please do correct me if I'm wrong, I presume a large part of the monetization of the site is through advertising. How does that work? So just as a really broad way, when you're talking about people not necessarily being able to speak about things on social media, is it similar as someone looking to gain advertising or advertisers onto a site?
A lot of what we do in terms of monetizing is kind of working with brands to help them tap into our audience. So that the original business model that we had, obviously the problems with advertising on social media, we kind of thought that we would get away with advertising because we weren't selling a product. So we started writing educational content about CBD and promoting it. Facebook didn't like that. And through lots of trying and arguing and back and forthing, we went down the same route as everyone else. We lost our ad accounts. So we had to kind of resort to writing content that people would share to build an audience and kind of get the numbers the hard way. But it worked. We've kind of had, I think it's about 500,000 reads over the last 12 months. So it's not a huge number. We're not Vice, but we're doing well considering we are in a challenging market, right? And then so the idea is that brands can then come to us and say, we like your audience. We think your audience is similar to ours. Why not produce some content together? So that's how we do it. But we do kind of, I'm a bit of a stickler for kind of one of the things we didn't want to do. And we noticed that other websites were doing this at the time was when we started trying to commercialize our work. A lot. So like, for example, reviews of CBD products, we do that. But what we do to do it differently, we noticed that certain websites were just kind of getting a product, opening it, tasting it, copy and pasting the about page information about the brand and going, this is their product, it's great, we tried it once. We get products and we give them to our readers. So we've got a little team of a database of people who've signed up and filled a form in that we promoted for a little while, saying, look, join our review team. And so if you're a brand, you'll send us 4 of your products and we'll send them out to people and go, right, try this. And we'll give them 2-3 weeks to try it and then say, right, give us your feedback. And then we publish that. And sometimes, not often, we get a little bit of, criticism or, kind of, I really like this product, say some gummies. I really like this product. 3 of the flavors were great, but 1 was a bit bitter. And we'll publish that because we want to be honest with our audience, first and foremost. We also think that delivers value for brands. If you're a brand and someone's Googling your reviews and they're all 5-star, like this is great, instantly you think, hang on a minute, where have you bought these from? You come on Leafy and you read the reviews like, yeah, this product's great, but the packaging was a bit flimsy or the labeling wasn't as good as it could be. That's valuable to the brand because it shows that the review's honest, but it also gives them some feedback. But it's also valuable to the consumer, and especially within CBD, right? We've had years of, kind of unscrupulous practices. We've had a trust issue. We've got this problem with, kind of like people getting FSA. So what the industry has needed for a long time is a bit of integrity and a bit of honesty. So we've always done that. We've kind of gone down that route, and that's not for every brand. Like we think we've never had the problem where every review's come back like this is crap, because we don't think a brand would send us some products and pay us some money knowing full well their products are crap. So it acts as like a sort of self-filtering system. But I just, I personally thought that, there was a better way of doing these things. And I think, when we speak to brands and tell them this, they're like, no, they always say, actually, we like that. We're happy that you're doing that. So yeah, that's kind of how we monetize at the moment. We've got some more ideas in the future, which I'll keep under my hat for now. But we're kind of we've got a lot of ideas, and it's kind of picking the right one. But yeah, that's kind of our backbone at the minute, and it seems to work. It keeps us afloat. Again, we could have gone down the route of becoming like a big CBD store, or kind of going for the use money. And again, the business content in the early days was probably the low hanging fruit. But we've always had this vision of where we want to be in 5, 6, 7 years, and doing the things that we're doing at the moment and doing it the way we're doing it. It's kind of building that foundation that we can continue to be kind of what we want to be in the future, rather than just being what we have to be now. And I think, touch wood, I think that's why we've survived to this point when others haven't.
I think it speaks to what you're trying to do and the vision that you have and the commitment to it, that you go about it in the way you do, because it's very different from what a lot of other people are doing. What you're trying to achieve, you're building it how you want it to be built. You're not just having to make sacrifices to make it happen so that you can get there. You're going, no, we're just going to do it this way. I think. Yeah,
don't get me wrong. There's room for lots of different types of content, especially within cannabis. There's websites that I admire because they have a different vibe and a different kind of focus to us. Like Cannabis Health News, they are very focused on the health industry, the medical cannabis industry, the patient stories. And I think that's great, like as a resource for people within the industry as much as out of it. That's awesome. But it's just not what we wanted to do. We are publishing a little bit of kind of how-to and educational content around medical cannabis, but not as laser focused as them. And I think that, again, that's kind of, it's all part of our vision for the future. We want to be a bit more of a broader, wider culture, not just, this one, kind of very narrow channel. There's plenty of room for that. But we kind of had this vision of being a bit of a broader church. And, again, I think it's working for the time being.
Most definitely. When you mentioned psychedelics, I'm flitting around here, but you mentioned psychedelics and how you've started to incorporate that into the content that you produce and the things that you speak about. Now, my opinion on psychedelics is that it's the next battleground in terms of legislative change compared with cannabis. So assuming that cannabis becomes adult use or recreational, however you want to put it, legal in the majority of places within the next 10 or 15 years is probably fairly likely, I would say. the psychedelics is almost the next step from that. Now, I see that as a harder junction than cannabis, because I think it's been less done historically by as many people. Cannabis is a lot of people.
It always sounds like proper drugs, doesn't it? When people talk, do you know? I mean, I'll just put it out there. I mean, people, you say cannabis, they go, you know, and they go, yeah, but it's a plant. It's not, you know. Well, you could say the same of certain psychedelics, couldn't you? But it's a very serious
word, isn't it? Compared to pot or weed, you know, psychedelics. It's just like the connotations that come with it. I think it's a harder sell than cannabis. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on the positive, not necessarily the positive spin on psychedelics. There's lots of research going on at the moment to talk about how positive it can be in certain circumstances. But how do you see that maybe playing out in the kind of general consciousness, and how do you talk about it in a way that does make it accessible when it maybe isn't as accessible as cannabis?
I think there's kind of two sides to it. So in a way, I think you're right. Like there are some historic connotations of psychedelics, you know, kind of, if we go back to kind of the counterculture movement, which, you know, essentially a lot of the rhetoric from leadership, governments like police forces, etc. I think a lot of it was fueled by fear, right? They were very scared, especially kind of if you go back to the counterculture movement, you know, the Vietnamese War. They were trying to enlist people to go and fight this war, and you know, they were all kind of, you know, doing acid and going, actually, you know, I'm shifting my perspective on patriotism and the country that I live in and humanity. You know, anyone will tell you who's had a significant psychedelic experience that there is a moment where you feel interconnected with the entire planet, not just every human being, but every living thing. You know, do some mushrooms or do some acid and look at a tree and you feel that tree, right? So when you've got a vast number of people having this experience, selling them the dream of bloody conflict becomes very difficult. So a lot of the old rhetoric is based in that. And, you know, we were told that one tab of acid and you'll jump out the window and think you can fly, right? That was drug education for me in the 90s, at least. And it turned out to not be true.
No, it smacks of the kind of year 9 police visit earlier. Well, what do you kids know about drugs then, sort of stuff, isn't it?
We've got a lot of that, right? But on the flip side, so the problem with cannabis, especially in the UK, right? So we'll focus on the UK for now. So the problem we've had with progressing cannabis in the UK is that the powers that be within the medical community, you know, the NHS, NIC, and all the kind of people that are in control of what can and can't be prescribed, they insist that we need randomized controlled trials. They're the gold standard of trials, where you isolate one compound, you give some people that compound, you give some others a placebo, you record the results of the test to see if it improves the condition, and you go, right, this compound improves this condition. We can see it. Here is the evidence. Let's be a bit more liberal with it. The problem cannabis has, obviously, is that there are hundreds of cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, you know, many components within the plant. You know, if you're talking about flower, then, you know, different parts of the plant, you know, the top buds versus the lower buds have different cannabinoid compounds. So even within the same plant, you've still got variations, and it's very hard to do these RCTs. And that's kind of where we're at this sticking point, why the NHS won't prescribe cannabis at the moment, because they say the trials that they want aren't there, and there's plenty of people trying to get around that. So I mean, what generally happens, or we've seen happen in kind of countries like in America, Canada, you know, even in Germany, you know, like they've had a medical cannabis kind of progress, and then from that has become recreational, right? And in the UK, that's a bit of a sticking point for us at the moment. However, with psychedelics and drugs like that, you've got one compound. So if you've got psilocybin, you've got psilocybin. You know, they don't give people magic mushrooms. They lab create, extract, or grow from yeast, whatever. They grow, you know, get some psilocybin. You can guarantee that if you give someone a 25 milligram capsule of psilocybin, they've had exactly 25 milligrams of psilocybin. So to be able to convince people that that drug works and is safe and is available for medical use is a lot easier. So that could, in theory, then lead to a bit more relaxation. I mean, it's happening in America, you know, like Denver, they've decriminalized possession of psilocybin because basically there was a public-led vote, and the people who led the vote said, look, the majority of people in possession of psilocybin are doing so to microdose or to do kind of a larger journey, but for mental health reasons or for personal development. You know, there's no evidence of people, you know, breaking into a house and stealing your jewelry to get, you know, the money for another mushroom trip, because most people do 2-3 grams of mushrooms, go, yeah, that was great, but I don't really want to see them again for 6 months or whatever. So, there's no impulsive behavior. In terms of safety, they're relatively, benign, like, on the scale of drug harms, especially psilocybin, it's quite low down. It's one of the safest drugs, both to the person and to the wider community. So I think the battleground for psilocybin or psychedelics in general will be fought medically. I think that battle will be easier than the battle for cannabis in the UK, at least, because you can, like I say, you can do a trial, you can give someone 25 milligrams or something, you can check up on them 6 months down the line and make sure they're okay. And you can easily write a paper and go, look, we tested this, it's safe, let's use more of it. So at the minute, things like psychedelics are in Schedule 1, which means that to have them as a doctor or as a medical professional, you have to do a lot of paperwork, they have to be in the lock and key. There's a lot of nonsense really to work with them. Whereas cannabis is a little bit easier, but to actually get the progress with psychedelics is going to be a lot easier for especially the medical community. So I think from that perspective, the battle is different. It's easier one, and I think it's a logical progression because, again, there is a global movement in this. We are seeing every single trial is pretty much coming back and going, yeah, this is good. These are an alternative. You could throw in a bit of the kind of conspiracy theory that Big Pharma won't like it, but I don't really think that will happen. So like I say, it's almost kind of a different battle. But I think it will be easier. I think the progress will happen more smoothly and more efficiently than with cannabis. And I wouldn't be surprised that if and when we see better access to medical cannabis, that very soon we get more kind of access to psychedelics. I mean, in the UK, we've got kind of ketamine clinics popping up because ketamine is not Schedule 1. It can be prescribed off license, so it can be prescribed by a qualified doctor for use other than what is on the label, right? So we're already seeing those pop up. They're expensive, but they exist. And I don't think it will be very long until we see kind of psilocybin clinics popping up within the UK, because I think the data is easy to produce. I think the arguments are easy to back up, and obviously, if we have the gold standard RCTs that the NHS say we don't have for cannabis, but we have them for psilocybin, they can't really say no. So it wouldn't surprise me if you get psychedelic therapy on the NHS before you get cannabis.
Oh, definitely going to write that down. That's I think it's a
I'm
really
not too much money on it, but
genuinely really interesting take. Yeah, I think it completely backed up as well. I've not really considered from that perspective, but you're right. It does allow for far easier testing when you're just looking at single compounds, which is the thing that cannabis struggles with as a medicine, because it's a whole plant. It isn't just one pill or one compound. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Really interesting.
But let me ask as well, do you think, again, the sort of hard work of the sort of cannabis advocates and things like that are sort of paving the way culturally for something like psilocybin to become more acceptable as a medication? I mean, the sort of... Yeah, I guess there's a lot of crossover, right? I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of people who campaign for greater access to cannabis do so from a medical perspective. They say, look, instead of taking 15 pills like opioids, benzodiazepines, etc., instead of taking all of this stuff, I can take one plant. And quite a lot of the arguments are this is natural, it grows. I can control if I'm growing my own plant, I can control what plant I grow. I can make sure that there are no harsh additives, no chemicals, no pesticides, etc., etc. So that argument is prevalent within kind of cannabis campaigning, and rightly so, because people should be given a choice. And I think quite a lot of the people who are pro cannabis are pro natural solutions, and therefore naturally more predisposed to say psilocybin as a treatment for depression. Obviously, there is an argument that psilocybin does need a little bit more control because it is a bit more powerful than just kind of smoking a joint or whatever. But yeah, I think
Whether it paves the way, I don't know, but I think maybe the acceptance, we have got more, 53% on average, or around 50 to 55% now on average of people in surveys, YouGov surveys, there's a, recent survey, are pro cannabis being legalized, right? So I think people making cannabis more understood as a medicine has definitely kind of opened the general public's eyes to other natural alternatives. And it's interesting because you don't kind of really see the same level of campaigning for psilocybin, say, as an example, in the UK. I think those people exist, but it is more the medical kind of community. You kind of look at your Carl Harris's who have, pioneered the way and said, like, actually, we think that this could be a solution. And whether they kind of got into that from looking at, kind of the medical cannabis community, or whether they looked at it from kind of the work that was been doing on in the 60s and 70s until these drugs were, kind of scheduled and considered, to have no medical value. I would say it's probably the latter. But I definitely think that the general idea of, cannabis isn't as bad as we have been told, kind of opens the door for that conversation about other substances. And when you do look at kind of the work done by kind of David Nutt, etc., where they kind of published in the Lancet, the recreational drugs scales of harms, kind of when people look at things like that evidence to say, actually, here's what I heard from Steve down the road, who's a cannabis campaigner, and then here's what I've read in the Guardian, or the Lancet, and then people kind of put those two together, and it changes attitudes that way.
I think we always say it's a slow roll, right? So when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem like any movement is happening. But if you just compare where we are now to where we were 5 years ago in the UK, especially, the difference is night and day. So it is coming, and it's in anything that chips away at that kind of general consciousness around drugs, or certainly the stigmas that surround it. I think it will have a positive effect. When we met at Cannabis Europa, we spoke a little bit about kind of social equity, or maybe about the difference or the differences in different communities that have been negatively affected by the war on drugs. There's a really general term for cannabis specifically. When you look at the social equity efforts that are out there, I know that the US have quite a lot of programs going where they have preferential treatment for certain communities, for licenses, for grants. I think there are some tax benefits in certain areas, depending on what programs you work in. How important do you think those types of programs are? And what do you think maybe the UK could do better or start to do, as we're in sort of a nascent space where at the moment we don't really have any kind of small outfits that are growing cannabis, but it probably will happen in the future. What do you think are some of the things that maybe the government or people who are campaigning at the moment should be looking at to help the kind of communities that have been more negatively affected?
I think, one of the things, as much as it's kind of, I feel people's frustration about the slower progress in the UK than other places, but it gives us an advantage in that we can look at the mistakes and the things that people get right. So, looking at kind of North America and Canada, we can see what mistakes they made. Kind of a lot of the early adopting states in the US kind of just went for the free for all, very American, open market, let the market work it all out. Some of the others went a little bit too far. So, kind of like California went a bit too heavy on the tax to try and recoup some of the, the benefits. So there's lots of lessons we can learn from there. I think New York are getting it right. So they are investing heavily in kind of, or promising to kind of put back into communities that were affected, generally speaking, marginalized immigrant communities and Black communities. And, that's something that we see in the UK. The data is out there. There is no argument that if you are a Black or brown male in London, you are far more likely to get searched on the basis that you might have cannabis or a weapon just on the basis of your appearance. So there is loads of opportunity to kind of model that and learn from that and kind of do that in the UK. And I think it's really important, kind of putting money back into communities that have probably suffered at the hands of overzealous policing. But also, we're going to be following the examples, and I think we'll probably follow the examples more closely of Germany and Switzerland, right? As much as, some people will not have you believe, we are closer to our European neighbours than we are our American brothers and sisters, because culturally, geographically, and even kind of economically and politically, our country runs a lot closer to our nearer neighbours. And obviously, kind of jumping on stereotypes here, but the Germans and the Swiss, they don't have a reputation for kind of messing around. Like Germany are going to do it the right way. They're going to look at this and go, right, how can we do this to A, protect people from a health perspective, B, make sure that people get the medical help that they need, but C, we reinvest that money into our communities. Switzerland obviously doing it in a very Swiss way, very efficient. We're going to give 5,000 people access to cannabis and then see, in a couple of years how that impacts them, their communities and wider society. I mean, looking a bit closer to home at kind of what's potentially out there, if something changed tomorrow, I think the Green Party have the absolute, for me, perfect approach to cannabis legalization. So they have everything covered from medical right through to recreational. So the way I see it, some people will want to go to a doctor at a clinic, possibly. I mean, I think it was Mike Barnes say at Cannabis Europa, like he wants to see the end of cannabis clinics and see like a pain clinic where there is a specialist within that clinic who can prescribe cannabis as part of a wider treatment. And I think we'll have that sort of kind of spectrum. So you can go to a clinic, you can get expert advice, you can get a very controlled dose of your cannabinoids for your particular symptoms, and you can get regular checkups to make sure that you are progressing medically and getting the relief that you need with cannabis as a solution. Then there will be retail stores where you can go in, you can buy some weed, it can be top shelf, cookies import from US, or right down to homegrown. These shops get licenses based on specific conditions. You can't sell to under 21s or under 18s. You have to open at certain times. You have to have limits on what you can, blah, blah, blah. So all those kind of things, right through to cannabis social clubs where people can get a different kind of education and advice from a kind of medical professional. Because again, I think cannabis social clubs will have they'll be driven by people who are more passionate about the plant than anyone else. So they've probably been growing underground for years. They've dedicated their lives and they've maybe bred their own strains and they know everything that they possibly can, and they'll pass that information onto the wider community, right down to home growers. If you want to grow a few plants in your basement, you've got a bad back. You don't really care what strain you have as long as it's got roughly 15% THC, 5% CBD. You can go online, buy your seeds, grow your own plants. And it's the same we can do with alcohol, right? I can brew my own pea pod wine in the basement, or I can go and spend 500 quid on a bottle of champagne, right? And I can do anything in between. I can go to a bar and drink, a £5 pint of lager with friends in a social environment. I can brew my own. I can buy some from a shop and take it home, or I can go out and spend stupid amounts of money on ridiculously top shelf stuff. One of the other things that I really, really like about the green policy is that they have a kind of a minimum CBD content, right? So all this kind of hysteria around psychosis and schizophrenia and blah, blah, blah. It's kind of been proven that CBD is an antipsychotic. So they've kind of specified, I think it's 1% minimum CBD content, which would hopefully, and we'd like to think that based on the scientific evidence we have, that would mitigate a lot of the risks and potential, problems that kind of selling high strength products could present. And then, if you have a policy like that in the UK, it makes money from tax revenue that goes back into the marginalised communities. It goes back into education. It goes back into healthcare. I know the police kind of get a bad rap within kind of cannabis advocacy and campaigning, but some of that money can go back. Police forces are struggling for budget. Some of that money could be ring fenced and put into that, and that would be of a benefit to the wider community. So I would love to see, essentially, I encourage anyone listening to go and have a look at the Green Party kind of policy, drug policy for cannabis. It's comprehensive, it's well thought out, it covers all kind of spectrums of kind of, how people might want to access, because, quite often people will criticize, say, well, if it does happen in the UK, it'll only be about a marginal number of people making money. But, the Green Party policy, it's considers the whole community, it considers the impact, it considers where that money could go and how it could benefit society as a whole, and how people could be protected and looked after from kind of a harm reduction point of view. And I think if we could do something like that, and I think it's quite similar to what we'll get in Germany, to be honest with you. I think if the UK did something like that, in 5-10 years, people would look back and go, why didn't we do this sooner? Like, everyone wins, right? But
the powers that be in the way of sensible change.
Proportional representation on voting, because that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, first past the post, maybe a different day.
Well, yeah.
No, I think it's a really good point. And when people are coming up with legislation that is, or at least proposals for legislation that is comprehensive and that is well thought out and that really takes into account all the different stakeholders and groups that are a part of legalizing it, whether it is medical or recreational or both, that is hugely important. And that, as you say, is the advantage of doing things slowly, is that we can actually pick and choose how we do this and learn from the mistakes of others. So we can skip over taxation, we can increase CBD, percentages or THC percentages in medicinally grown cannabis for hemp farmers, so they can do CBD extraction. There's lots of different ways of making the industry viable, as well as protecting and educating people at the same time. I think that's a lot really, really important. And also, if you do a leafy pea pod wine, I'll 100% buy a batch.
So yeah, my granddad used to make homebrew, and I never tried it because I was too young before he passed away. But my dad tells me tales of it. Quite lethal stuff, apparently. Lethal
stuff. Well, I look. If any of it is ever going, let us know. Liam, it's been really, really great chatting to you. Thank you ever so much for coming on. Obviously, people know you a lot better than they know us, and certainly know Leafy a lot better than they know us. But I would encourage anyone who by chance is listening to this and hasn't heard Leafy to go out and check out what you guys are doing and the sort of content and stories that you're putting together, because they really are good. Thank you. And well worth getting into and becoming invested in. So thank you ever so much for coming on, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
All the best. Cheers.
Bye-bye.